The chain-link fence rattled softly in the autumn breeze, and Officer Jake Matthews felt the tension in the leash before he even saw the girl. Atlas, his canine partner for the past 4 years, a Belgian Malinois with an impeccable service record and nerves like steel, had gone completely rigid. The dog's ear snapped forward, his weight shifted onto his front paws, and a low, rumbling growl started deep in his chest. It wasn't the warning bark Atlas used for suspects trying to run. It wasn't the excited whine he made when he found contraband during a search. This was something else entirely, something that made the hair on the back of Jake's neck stand up, even though he couldn't see anything unusual in the empty parking lot beyond the precinct's back fence. Then he saw her. The little girl, same as every other afternoon for the past 3 weeks. She stood about 15 feet from the fence, partially hidden behind the trunk of an old oak tree, her small hands gripping the strap of a faded pink backpack. 8 years old, maybe 9. Dark hair pulled into a ponytail that had come half loose, jeans with grass stains on the knees, a jacket 2 sizes too big for her narrow shoulders, and those eyes, wide and unblinking, locked onto Atlas with an intensity that didn't belong on a child's face. Jake had noticed her the first time she appeared. It was hard not to. Kids walked past the precinct all the time, curious about the patrol cars and the officers in uniform, sometimes waving or asking questions about the police dogs. But this girl never waved, never smiled, never called out or came close enough to press her face against the fence like other children did. She just waited. Every single day at exactly 3:47 in the afternoon, she appeared at the edge of the parking lot and stood perfectly still until Atlas finished his afternoon training routine. Then, the moment Jake led Atlas back toward the building, she turned and walked away without a sound. At first, Jake thought she was simply shy, maybe fascinated by the dogs, but too nervous to approach. He'd tried waving to her, calling out a friendly greeting, even walking Atlas closer to the fence so she could see him properly. She'd watched every movement with those huge, serious eyes but never responded, never spoke. The other officers had noticed her too. Dispatch joked that the precinct had picked up a tiny stalker. Sergeant Chen suggested she might be waiting for a parent who worked nearby. No one was particularly worried, just curious. After all, she never tried to enter the property, never caused any trouble, and she always left before dark. But Atlas had started acting strange about a week ago. The dog would tense up minutes before the girl even appeared, his nose working the air, his body language shifting from relaxed to alert without any visible trigger. Jake had checked the area Atlas saw, thinking maybe there was a stray animal or some other distraction Atlas was picking up on. Nothing, just the girl, standing in her usual spot, staring with that unnerving focus. Jake had been a canine handler long enough to trust his partner's instincts completely. Atlas didn't react to nothing. If the dog sensed something wrong, something was wrong. Today was different, though. Today, Atlas wasn't just alert, he was agitated. Urgent. The growl in his chest had escalated to a series of sharp, insistent barks, and he was pulling against the leash with a force Jake hadn't felt since their last felony stop. The girl hadn't moved from her spot by the tree, but Jake could see her shoulders had drawn up tight, her hands clenching the backpack straps so hard her knuckles had gone white. She looked afraid. Not of Atlas, exactly. It was something else, something deeper. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured, wrapping the leash tighter around his hand and planting his feet. Atlas ignored him completely, which almost never happened. The dog lunged forward, barking in rapid, frantic bursts, his eyes locked on the girl with laser focus. She stumbled backward, her sneakers skidding on the loose gravel, and that's when Jake saw it. The way she moved. The way her left hand flew automatically to her ribs, her face twisting in a wince she tried desperately to hide. The way she caught herself and froze, as if movement itself hurt. Jake's training kicked in before his conscious mind fully processed what he was seeing. He scanned her visible skin with the practiced eye of someone who'd worked child welfare calls before. Fading yellow-green bruises on her forearms, barely visible beneath the too long sleeves of her jacket. A fresh cut above her right eyebrow, still pink and healing. The way she held herself, protective, guarded, like a kid who'd learned the hard way to make herself small. Atlas finally stopped barking, but he didn't relax. He stood trembling with tension, every muscle coiled, his gaze fixed on the girl with an intensity that made Jake's chest tighten. This wasn't aggression. Atlas wasn't trying to scare her. He was trying to tell Jake something, trying to make him see what the dog had already figured out. Something was very, very wrong here, and this little girl, who showed up every single day at the same time, who never spoke and never asked for help, who watched Atlas like he was the only safe thing in her entire world. She was the reason his partner couldn't let it go. Jake took a slow breath and made a decision. He couldn't let her walk away again. Not today. Not after what he'd just seen. Whatever was happening, whatever had brought her here day after day, waiting in silence, it ended now. Jake raised a hand slowly, making sure his movements were calm and non-threatening. Atlas had quieted to a low whine, still staring at the girl, still radiating that urgent energy that made Jake's gut twist with concern. He needed to approach this carefully. One wrong word, and she'd bolt like a spooked deer. He'd seen it happen before with kids in bad situations. They learned to run before anyone could ask the questions they were terrified to answer. "Hey," he called out, keeping his voice gentle and even. "It's okay. Atlas isn't going to hurt you. I promise." The girl didn't respond, didn't move, just stood there with her hand pressed against her ribs and her eyes flickering between Jake and the dog. Her breathing was shallow and quick, fear or pain or both. Jake took a single step forward, then stopped, giving her space. "You come here a lot," he continued, trying to find the right tone. Friendly but not pushy, concerned but not interrogating. "We've seen you watching." Atlas has been wanting to say hello properly. Still nothing. But she hadn't run yet. That was something. Jake crouched down slightly, making himself smaller, less imposing. Atlas shifted beside him, his ears swiveling forward, and the tension in his body eased just a fraction. The dog took a half step toward the fence, then sat. A trained behavior, a signal of calm. It was almost like Atlas understood exactly what Jake was trying to do. "You don't have to be scared of him," Jake said quietly. "He's a good boy. The best partner I've ever had." He paused, watching her face for any flicker of response. Her eyes stayed locked on Atlas, and for just a second. Just the briefest moment. Something softened in her expression. Something that looked almost like longing. "You like dogs?" Jake asked, even though he already knew the answer. She'd been coming here for weeks just to watch. Of course she liked dogs. The girl's lips parted slightly, like she might speak, but then she pressed them together again and looked down at her feet. Her shoulders trembled. Not from cold, Jake realized, but from the effort of holding something back. Tears, maybe, or words she'd been told never to say. He felt a surge of protective anger rise in his chest, hot and sharp, but he forced it down. Anger wouldn't help her. Patience would. Calm would. Showing her she could trust him, that would. "My name's Jake," he said, resting one hand lightly on Atlas's back. "And this is Atlas. We work together. He helps me keep people safe." He let that sit for a moment, then added carefully, "Are you safe?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy and loaded with meaning. The girl's head snapped up, her eyes going wide, and Jake saw the panic flare across her face. She took a step backward, her sneakers crunching on the gravel, and her hand tightened on the backpack strap like it was a lifeline. I'm fine," she whispered, and her voice was so small and hoarse it barely carried across the distance. It was the first time Jake had ever heard her speak. The first time in 3 weeks she'd acknowledged his existence with anything more than a stare. And the lie in those 2 words was so obvious, it made his chest ache. She wasn't fine. Nothing about this was fine. I like to see the dog. That's all." Jake nodded slowly, not challenging her, not pushing. "He's pretty great, isn't he?" he said, keeping his tone light. "Smartest dog I've ever met. Sometimes I think he understands more than I do." Atlas's tail gave a single thump against the pavement, as if agreeing, and despite everything, the girl's mouth twitched. Almost a smile. Almost. "You can come closer if you want," Jake offered gently. "He won't jump or bark, I promise." She hesitated, her body swaying slightly like she was caught between wanting to move forward and needing to stay back. Her gaze dropped to Atlas again, and this time Jake saw it clearly, the desperate hunger in her eyes. She didn't just like dogs. She needed this. Needed to be close to something that felt safe and solid and kind. Something that wouldn't hurt her. Jake's throat tightened, and he made himself stay perfectly still, letting her make the choice. Slowly, so slowly it almost hurt to watch, the girl took 1 step forward. Then another. Her movements were stiff and careful, like every step cost her something. When she reached the fence, she stopped about 3 feet away and stood there, staring down at Atlas with an expression that was equal parts fear and longing. Atlas's tail wagged once, a gentle, careful movement, and he stretched his neck forward just slightly, his nose twitching as he scented the air around her. Then his whole body went tense again, not aggressive, but alert, focused. His eyes locked onto the pink backpack hanging from her shoulder, and a low whine escaped his throat. Jake felt his pulse kick up a notch. Atlas was trained in narcotics detection, but this wasn't his drug-alert behavior. This was something else. Something that made the dog uneasy. Jake's gaze shifted to the backpack. Faded pink fabric, scuffed and worn, with a small cartoon character patch sewn onto the front. It looked harmless. Normal, but Atlas didn't think so. "That's a nice backpack," Jake said carefully, watching her face. The girl's hand flew to the strap again, clutching it protectively, and her eyes went wide with something that looked a lot like fear. "What do you keep in there?" he asked, keeping his voice as gentle as possible. She shook her head quickly, a sharp, jerky motion, and took a step back from the fence. "Nothing," she whispered. Just my stuff." Atlas whined again, louder this time, and pawed at the ground. Jake's instincts screamed that whatever was in that backpack, it was the key to everything. Jake felt the leash go tight in his hand again as Atlas surged forward, every line of the dog's body screaming urgency. This wasn't curiosity. This wasn't even the focused intensity Atlas showed during a standard alert. This was something rawer, something that bypassed training and went straight to instinct. The dog's nose worked the air in short, rapid bursts. His attention locked on that worn pink backpack like it was the only thing in the world that mattered. And the girl, she was backing away now, her feet shuffling through the gravel, her whole body curling inward like she was trying to disappear. "It's okay," Jake said quickly, raising both hands in a placating gesture even as Atlas strained against the leash. "You're not in trouble." I just want to make sure you're all right." The words felt hollow even as he said them, because she clearly wasn't all right, and they both knew it. Her breathing had gone shallow and quick, her eyes darting between Jake and Atlas, and the empty parking lot behind her like she was calculating escape routes. She looked trapped, cornered. And Jake's heart twisted at the realization that he, a police officer, someone who was supposed to represent safety, was the one making her feel that way. Atlas barked once, sharp and insistent, and the girl flinched so hard she nearly dropped the backpack. Her hand flew to catch it, and Jake saw the way her face went pale, the way her fingers trembled as they gripped the faded fabric. Whatever was in there, she was terrified of losing it, or terrified of someone finding it. Jake couldn't tell which. He loosened his grip on the leash slightly, letting Atlas move a few inches closer to the fence, and watched the dog's reaction carefully. Atlas's ears were pinned forward, his tail low and still, his entire focus on that backpack. Not aggressive, not playful, just urgently, desperately focused. "Listen," Jake said, crouching down so he was closer to her eye level, making himself less threatening. "Atlas is trying to tell me something. He's trained to notice things that might be dangerous or might hurt someone. And right now, he's really, really interested in your backpack." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "I think he's worried about you. I think maybe I should be worried about you too." The girl's eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head violently, her ponytail whipping against her shoulders. "I have to go," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I wasn't supposed to. I shouldn't have." She turned to leave, and Jake felt panic surge through his chest. If she walked away now, if he let her disappear again without getting answers, he'd never forgive himself. Atlas wouldn't either. The dog was already whining, a high, distressed sound that Jake had only heard a handful of times in their years together. "Wait," Jake called out, standing up slowly. "Please. Just wait a second." She froze, her back to him, her shoulders shaking. "You come here every day," he said quietly. "Same time. Every single day for 3 weeks. You stand right there and you watch Atlas, and then you leave. And I think—" He took a breath. "I think maybe you've been trying to tell us something. Trying to ask for help without actually asking." She turned her head slightly, just enough that he could see her profile, the tear tracks already starting down her cheeks. "He looks like my dog," she whispered, so quietly Jake almost didn't hear it. "Atlas looks like my dog. The one I used to have." Her voice broke completely on the last word, and she pressed her free hand against her mouth like she could physically hold back the sob trying to escape. Jake felt something crack open in his chest. "What happened to your dog?" he asked gently. The girl didn't answer right away. She just stood there, crying silently, her whole body trembling. Atlas had gone completely still beside Jake, his ears swiveling toward her, his expression. If a dog could look heartbroken, Atlas looked heartbroken. Finally she spoke again, her words coming out in a rushing, broken whisper. "My mom died," she said. 2 months ago. Car accident. And I had to go live with my uncle, because there's nobody else. And he said my dog was too much trouble, so he got rid of him. And I don't know where." She couldn't finish. The sobs took over, shaking her thin shoulders, and she sank down onto the gravel like her legs couldn't hold her anymore. Jake's throat went tight. He glanced down at Atlas, who was watching the girl with an intensity that bordered on protective, and made a decision. He opened the gate in the chain-link fence, something he wasn't technically supposed to do without clearance, but protocol could go to hell right now, and stepped through, Atlas moving with him like a shadow. The girl looked up, startled, fear flashing across her face again, but Jake stopped several feet away and sat down on the ground himself, cross-legged, non-threatening. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I'm so sorry about your mom. And your dog." Atlas moved forward slowly, carefully, and lay down between Jake and the girl, his head resting on his paws, his eyes soft. It was the gentlest Jake had ever seen him. The girl stared at Atlas, her tears still falling, and slowly, so slowly, she reached out one shaking hand. Her fingers barely brushed the top of Atlas's head, but the dog's tail gave a single, careful wag. Permission. Comfort. "Your uncle," Jake said carefully, keeping his voice low and steady. "Does he get angry a lot?" The girl's hand froze on Atlas's fur, and Jake saw the answer in the way her whole body went rigid. "It's okay," he said quickly. "You can tell me. You're safe right now. I promise." She pulled her hand back and wrapped both arms around herself, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely audible. "He gets angry when I cry," she whispered. "He says I'm too loud, that I need to stop being a baby, and when I don't stop fast enough, he... She couldn't say it. Didn't need to. Jake had already seen the bruises. Already knew. Atlas lifted his head and whined softly, and the girl looked at him with desperate, aching eyes. "I come here because Atlas is safe," she said. Because when I see him, I can pretend for a little while that everything's okay, that I still have my dog, that my mom still..." Her voice shattered completely. Jake swallowed hard against the burning in his throat and looked down at the backpack still clutched in her arms. Atlas's gaze followed his, and the dog's nose twitched again, that same alert focus from before. "Can I see what's in your backpack?" Jake asked gently. The girl's eyes went wide with panic again, and she shook her head. "I'm not going to take anything," Jake promised. I think Atlas is trying to tell me something important, and I think maybe you need help. Real help." She stared at him for a long, breathless moment, and then, slowly, her hands loosened on the straps. She pulled the backpack off her shoulder with trembling hands and set it on the ground between them, her fingers lingering on the zipper like she was afraid of what would happen once it was open. Jake waited, not moving, barely breathing, letting her control the pace. Atlas remained perfectly still, his eyes tracking every tiny movement, and when the girl finally pulled the zipper open, with a soft metallic sound, the dog's ears twitched forward, but he didn't bark, didn't lunge, just watched. The girl reached inside and pulled out items one by one, setting them on the gravel with careful, deliberate movements. A juice box, still sealed. 2 granola bars. A small bag of crackers. A crumpled napkin. Jake's chest tightened as he realized what he was looking at. A stash. Food she'd been hiding, probably rationing. Atlas's nose worked the air around each item, and Jake understood now why the dog had been so alert. Not because of what was in the backpack, but because of what it represented. A child hoarding food. A child who wasn't sure when or if her next meal would come. "I take them from the school cafeteria," the girl whispered, her voice thick with shame. "I'm not supposed to, but my uncle, he doesn't always remember to make dinner, and I get so hungry at night and I..." She wrapped her arms around herself again, her whole body curling inward. "I know it's stealing. I know it's bad. But I didn't know what else to do." Jake felt his jaw clench so hard his teeth ached. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to keep his voice calm and steady, even though rage was burning through his veins like acid. "You're not bad," he said firmly. "You're not. You were doing what you had to do to survive. That's not stealing. That's just trying to stay alive." The words felt inadequate, too small for the enormity of what she'd been going through. But her eyes lifted to his, and he saw something flicker there. Hope, maybe, or the fragile beginning of belief that someone might actually understand. She reached into the backpack one more time and pulled out a folded piece of paper, creased and worn like it had been opened and closed 100 times. She held it out to Jake with shaking hands, and when he took it, their fingers brushed for just a second. Hers were ice cold. He unfolded the paper carefully, his eyes scanning the contents, and his stomach dropped. It was a school assignment, one of those getting-to-know-you worksheets teachers handed out at the beginning of the year. Name, age, favorite color, favorite food, and at the bottom, in careful, childish handwriting, an address. Jake recognized it immediately. He'd been to that house twice in the past 6 months. 2 separate domestic disturbance calls, neighbors reporting shouting, and the sound of things breaking. Both times the responding officers had found a man matching the description of the girl's uncle, hostile, defensive, reeking of alcohol. Both times he'd refused to let them inside, claimed everything was fine, and both times there hadn't been enough cause to push further. No visible victims, no immediate danger, just suspicion and bad feelings, and a system that required proof before it could act. The second call had been filed under a different last name. That's why no one had made the connection when the girl started appearing at the precinct. That's why no red flags had gone up. Different name, different case file, and a little girl slipping through the cracks because the system didn't talk to itself fast enough. Jake's hands tightened on the paper, crumpling the edges slightly, and he looked up at the girl with an intensity that made her shrink back. "This is where you live?" he asked, keeping his voice level even though his pulse was hammering in his ears. She nodded, her eyes huge and wet with tears. "With your uncle?" Another nod. "And he's the one who hurt you?" She didn't nod this time. Didn't have to. The answer was written all over her face, in the bruises on her arms, in the way she held her ribs, in the hollow, haunted look in her eyes that no 8-year-old should ever have. Atlas shifted slightly, pressing his shoulder against Jake's leg. A grounding touch, a reminder to stay calm, to think clearly. Jake took a breath and pulled his radio from his belt with his free hand. "Dispatch, this is Matthews," he said, his voice clipped and professional even though his insides were churning. "I need a welfare check and child services response to 427 Maple Street. I have a juvenile in distress, visible signs of physical abuse, and credible disclosure of ongoing neglect and endangerment. I also need a supervisor and a detective to my location at the precinct immediately." The dispatcher's voice crackled back through the radio, confirming the request, and Jake clipped the device back onto his belt. He looked at the girl, who was staring at him with an expression caught somewhere between terror and relief. "You're not going back there," he said quietly. "Not today. Not ever if I have anything to say about it. You understand?" She nodded slowly, and a fresh wave of tears spilled down her cheeks. But this time they looked different, lighter somehow, like something inside her had finally been allowed to break open and breathe. "What's your name?" Jake asked gently, realizing with a sick jolt that he'd never actually asked. That she'd been coming here for 3 weeks, and no one had thought to get her name. She wiped at her face with the back of her hand, smearing dirt and tears across her cheek. "Mia?" she whispered. "My name is Mia." "Okay, Mia," Jake said, and he let himself smile just a little, trying to offer her something warm and steady to hold on to. "You did the right thing, coming here, waiting for us to notice. I'm sorry it took so long. But we see you now. And we're not going to let anything else happen to you. I promise." Atlas moved then, slow and deliberate, crawling forward on his belly until his head was resting gently against Mia's knee. She looked down at him, and for the first time since Jake had met her, she smiled. A small, fragile, heartbreaking smile. Her hand found the soft fur between Atlas's ears, and she held on like he was the only solid thing in a world that had been spinning out of control for far too long. And maybe, Jake thought as he watched them, maybe Atlas had been the only solid thing. Maybe that's why she kept coming back. The sound of footsteps on pavement pulled Jake's attention up. Officer Chen was approaching from the building, her expression sharp and concerned. And behind her, Jake could see Sergeant Morris and Detective Foster already moving with purpose. The system was in motion now. Slow and imperfect as it was finally moving for Mia. Jake stayed where he was, sitting on the cold ground with his partner pressed against a little girl who'd been waiting 3 weeks for someone to ask the right question, and silently swore that he'd never ignore Atlas's instincts again. The social worker arrived within 20 minutes. A woman in her mid-40s with kind eyes and a messenger bag slung over her shoulder. Her name was Sarah Winters, and she'd worked Child Protective Services for 15 years. Long enough to move quickly when a call came through with words like visible bruising and ongoing neglect. She knelt down beside Mia with practiced gentleness, introducing herself in a soft voice that somehow managed to cut through the chaos of radios crackling and officers conferring in low, urgent tones near the precinct door. Mia didn't let go of Atlas. Her fingers stayed buried in his fur, and the dog didn't move an inch, his body warm and solid against her leg like an anchor keeping her from drifting away entirely. Jake stood a few feet back, giving them space but staying close enough that Mia could see him if she looked up. Detective Foster was beside him now, reviewing the notes Jake had taken, his jaw tight as he scanned the address and the history of prior calls. "We should have caught this," Foster muttered under his breath, his voice edged with frustration. 2 calls to that address and no follow-through because he wouldn't let us in. No one thought to check if there were kids involved. Jake didn't respond. There was nothing to say that would make it better. They'd all missed it. The whole system had missed it. And Mia had paid the price. Sarah Winters finished her initial assessment and rose to her feet, her expression calm, but her eyes hard with the kind of anger that came from seeing too many cases like this. She spoke briefly with Detective Foster, her voice too low for Jake to hear, but he saw the detective nod and pull out his phone, already making calls. Within minutes, 2 patrol units were dispatched to the address on Maple Street with instructions to secure the scene and detain the uncle if he was present. An arrest warrant was being expedited based on the evidence Jake had documented. The bruises, the cut above Mia's eyebrow, her disclosure of physical punishment, and the food hoarding that pointed to neglect. It wasn't enough to solve everything, but it was enough to get her out, enough to make sure she was safe tonight. Mia sat very still through all of it, her hand never leaving Atlas's fur, her eyes tracking the movement of every adult around her like she was trying to figure out if she could trust what was happening. Sarah crouched down again and spoke to her gently, explaining what would happen next, that she'd be staying somewhere safe for the night, that people were going to make sure her uncle couldn't hurt her anymore, that there were family members being contacted to see if someone else could take care of her. "Do you have any other relatives?" Sarah asked carefully. "Anyone you feel safe with?" Mia's voice was barely a whisper. "My Aunt Lisa. She's my mom's sister. She lives in Portland." Sarah's expression brightened slightly, and she made a note on the tablet she was carrying. "Okay, that's good. We'll reach out to her tonight and see if she's able to take you in. Would you like that?" Mia nodded, and for the first time since the conversation had started, something that looked almost like hope flickered across her face. "She wanted to take me after Mom died," Mia said quietly. "But my uncle said no. He said he was family too, and he had rights, and she couldn't fight him because she lives so far away." Jake's hands curled into fists at his sides. legal custody, parental rights, all the bureaucratic walls that kept kids trapped in dangerous situations because the system valued biology over safety. But those walls were coming down now. Foster was already coordinating with the district attorney's office, and Jake knew from experience that once an emergency custody order was issued, Mia's aunt would have every legal avenue she needed to step in. It would take time, but it would happen. Sarah stood and nodded to Jake. "We're going to take her to the crisis center for tonight," she said. "Medical evaluation, safe bed, counseling staff on site. I'll stay with her through intake." She glanced down at Mia, then back at Jake with a small, knowing smile. "I don't suppose there's any way she could say goodbye to her friend first?" Jake looked at Atlas, who was still pressed against Mia's side, and then at Mia herself, whose eyes had filled with fresh tears at the realization that she'd have to leave him. He made a decision that was probably against a dozen different policies and procedures, but he didn't care. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think we can arrange that." He knelt down beside Mia and rested a hand lightly on Atlas's back. "You did good today," he told her. "You were so brave. And Atlas, he's really glad you came here. He's glad we got to help you." Mia's face crumpled, and she leaned forward, wrapping her arms around Atlas's neck and burying her face in his fur. The dog turned his head slightly and licked her cheek once, a gentle, deliberate gesture, and Jake felt his throat go tight. "He'll be here," Jake said softly. "Whenever you want to visit. I promise. You don't have to wait by the fence anymore. You can come right in. Official visitor, anytime you want." Mia pulled back just enough to look at him, her eyes red and swollen, but clearer than they'd been all afternoon. "Really?" she whispered. Jake nodded. "Really." 2 weeks later, Mia walked through the precinct's front door holding her Aunt Lisa's hand. She looked different. Her hair was brushed and tied back with a clean ribbon. Her clothes fit properly. The cut above her eyebrow had healed to a thin pink line, and the bruises on her arms had faded to almost nothing. But the biggest change was in her eyes. They weren't hollow anymore. They weren't haunted. They looked like a kid's eyes again. Hopeful, bright, alive. Jake met them in the lobby, and Atlas was with him, tail wagging the moment he saw Mia. She let go of her aunt's hand and ran forward, dropping to her knees as Atlas bounded over and nearly knocked her over with enthusiasm. She laughed, an actual, genuine laugh, and hugged him tight while he licked her face and wiggled with joy. Her aunt stood beside Jake, her own eyes wet with tears, and she reached out to shake his hand. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "for seeing her, for not letting her slip away." Jake watched Mia and Atlas playing together on the precinct floor, her laughter echoing off the walls, and felt something settle in his chest. "She's the one who did the hard part," he said quietly. "She came here every day and waited for us to notice. All we had to do was pay attention." And as Atlas rolled onto his back, so Mia could scratch his belly, Jake thought about all the other kids who might be waiting right now. Waiting for someone to see them. Waiting for someone to ask the right question. He looked down at his partner, at the dog who'd refused to let this one go, and made himself a promise. He'd keep watching. They both would.